I guess I can say it best like this. Father Al every day made a decision to die to self. And because he died to self, the seed dropped into the ground and he grew an incomprehensible harvest. A priest is ordained to save souls. Father Al saved generations of souls. This venerable Aloysius Schwartz, the world starves for the man, for the priest, for the future saint that he is. I had written a book a few years ago called The Priests We Need to Save the Church. And it was a plea. It was a plea for priests to be the martyrs in the same dimension as the martyrs of the early church. So I studied the lives of Bosco, Neary, Newman, Colby, John Paul, Charles Borromeo. And when the book came out, a married couple came up to me and they said, we know who the priest we need to save the church is. And his name is Venerable Aloysius Schwartz. And I said, I don't know who it is. I don't want to write the book. They said, well, we think you need to know who he is. So they gave me some reading literature, and I began to read, and I said, my goodness, I've just read the lives of the greatest priest saints in the history of the world, and I have not read what I just did about this venerable Al. So I priest Monsignor James Golosinski, who's 91 years old. He's in Texas. He was my greatest source for the book. He said, Kevin, I was there and I saw it. He was the boldest man I've ever known. And he only could do it for one reason. He had consecrated his entire life to Mary. And that's why I think I'm in the perfect room right now, because you're missionaries and you're marrying. Father Al, if you could sort of have a kaleidoscope, like a whirling kaleidoscope. If it's in the Bible, I do it. If the saints did it, then I do it. And if Mary calls me, then I go. Bible, saints, Mary. It's that simple with Father Al. So, who's Father Al? You could not have been born at a worse time in the history of America. Adolf Hitler was on the rise in the 1930s. The Depression had just started. Over 15 million people had lost their jobs. The dust storms had just kicked up in the Midwest. People were building these Hooverville shanties all over D.C., and Al Schwartz is born. He's born to a father who has a 6th grade education. As the crow flies, the house is about 8 to 10 miles away from where we're sitting right now in Northeast D.C., born on the wrong side of the tracks. Here's Father Al's dad, little Al's dad, who could barely read or write, trying to raise a family of 9 in the teeth of the Great Depression, when people were being thrown out on the alleyways. And this is when Al, at the age of around 7 or 8 years old, according to his brother Lou's now deceased, Lou said, I knew that Al was unique because back then he looked at the conditions of our house and of the neighborhood and the sort of the slum-like setting we lived in, and he began to think, it seems like God has turned his face away from our family. Now it's time for me to understand what faith is. I don't see God. I don't feel him. There's no consolations. Oftentimes there's not food. Now's the time to really get to know God. 7 or 8 years old, he said this. At the age of 12, his uncle, his dad's brother, his uncle lived in Minnesota, and he owned a 5 and 10, a little dime store, and because he knew the Schwartz family was poor, and they needed a lift, the uncle used to send down the leftover comic books that nobody bought that month. So it was the Lone Ranger and Captain Marvel and Superman, and Al would always throw them out. He didn't care about them, but there was one comic that pierced him, and it was called the Boy Commandos. And the Boy Commandos were 4 orphan boys that used to travel the world. And they used to go into Hitlerville and Naziville, and they would take on the bad guys that nobody else would, because he understood that if chaos was not addressed, that chaos would ensue. And Al said at the age of 12 or 13, I wonder if priests can save this way. And I wanted to be a Major League Baseball player when I was a kid. I'm from a family of 10, all the Wells boys played baseball, and as I grew older, I realized my talent level did not work, and it just kind of plummeted. When Al said at the age of 12 he wanted to be a priest, it just mushroomed, and it just grew. It couldn't be stopped, it just grew. And at the age of 14 years old, he was the only kid in town, the only one who got a full scholarship offer to Gonzaga High School. The only one. His dad said, thank goodness, we're finally on the map. You're going to Gonzaga, now I can finally brag about something. And Al said, Dad, it's not going to happen. I'm going to join seminary. You sure? Yeah. So he ends up with the Maryknollers because he wanted to be a missionary. Now we begin to understand who Father Al is. It was the 1950s, and he was excelling with Maryknollers. Maryknollers back down on King of the Hill as far as missionaries. And Father Al went up to the rector one day and he said, I'm discerning Al. He's like, Al, what are you talking about? You're the vice president of the class. You're the editor of the college newspaper. Everyone loves you. You're on the track. You're a star Maryknoller. He said, yeah. I don't want you. Al, what's good? In the summers, I've been noticing that when your community goes to the Congo, or the Philippines, or Central America, or Japan, when the sun sets and the moon begins to rise, your Maryknollers go back to the rectories and to their homes. And there's televisions and there's radios, and oftentimes there's AC and there's heat, and there's 3 squares and there's snacks and sweets, and until your Maryknollers cross the threshold, cross the periphery, and live among the poor and be poor and show their poverty, then the poor will never, in a sense, really trust them. You do good work, but I need something rawer. I need something more austere. And this is back when Father Al said, I want to live like Jesus Christ, the starved man on the cross. I want to know Jesus as the starved man. And he became the first American in the history of Maryknoller formation to drop out. And he found what he was looking for in Belgium. An order of priests called the Samists. And Samists would live poor, among the poor, in the poorest countries in the world. So poor parish priests. And he said, bingo, that's me. So every single person in his family said, dumbest mistake you ever made. Mom was deceased at this point. Dad, he had some sisters, some religious sisters. Dumb, Al, dumb. You don't. Nobody gave him any support. No one. Best friends, Maryknollers, siblings, dad. Don't do it. How bold do you have to be? How much faith do you have to be to say, well, thanks for your input. I'm going to catch a boat, catching a ship. Why? Because Mary was calling him. He said, Mary was calling me from 1933 in a town called Banno, Belgium. A little town that reminded Al of Nazareth, or maybe like ours, where John Vianney converted the town and the rest of France thereafter. A little podunk town where 200 people lived. The second year, by the way, just to tell you a little bit about Al at this point, only French was spoken in classrooms. So when he took off to Banno, to Louvain to continue his study for seminary, he had 4 years to go, he didn't speak the language, he didn't speak French. So he was 4 months behind in the course load, didn't speak French. By the end of the semester, he was had only caught his classmates from Belgium, Germany, France, but he was passing them by. Because he had it. But he fell in love with this apparition site, Banno, Belgium. Show of hands, who's heard of the approved apparition site in Banno, Belgium? We got a couple hands. So 8 times Mary appeared to a 13-year-old peasant girl named Mariette Becco. Banno was a town that was rocked, like all of Belgium, by World War I. A devastated town, and they had dropped the Catholic faith. So they would hear the church bells ring in the morning, or the Angelus bell, they just wouldn't pray. Sunday, church bells would ring, they just wouldn't go to Mass. So it was a town of guilt. They had left the Catholic faith. By and large, everyone had left. And one winter night in 1933, Mariette Becco pressed her nose up against the frozen window pane of her little house, family of 12, and who's hovering outside the window but a smiling vision of Our Lady. And it was the third apparition that speaks everything about Father Al. Mary had coaxed Mariette out of the house, and she revealed herself as, "I am Mary, the Virgin of the poor. I have come to bring relief to the suffering, to the humiliated." It was the first time in the history of Marian apparitions where Mary revealed herself, associated herself with the poor, And she was always smiling. Oftentimes we know that Mary in her apparition sites isn't smiling because she's heartbroken. She becomes very stern, and very sad. But Mary was smiling in all 8 of these apparitions, which is beautiful, very beautiful. And on this third apparition, Mary said, "Come on, Mariette." And there was a little, formerly unseen little brook, a little stream of water. And it was a January night in Belgium. This time of year is very cold. It's in the teens or below. It's very cold. It's in the northwestern part of Europe. And Mary encouraged Mariette to plunge her hands into the water and just leave them there. It's kind of cruel for Mary to do, right? That's kind of cruel. Why would Mary ask little Mariette to do that? And Al said, I get it. This is it. Mary is asking Mariette to understand this is a continuation of Fatima. These are the penances and mortifications that we must do for poor sinners, especially the poor sinners in this town who have stopped going to Mass or that no one's praying for. Mary wants Mariette to understand the humiliation that Christ felt on the cross with her hands in this freezing water that are becoming frozen, deadened. And Al said, "Yup, Mary, I am now your slave. I want you to take me in a certain way. I want you to send me to the worst places, the most far-flung places where I can actually live like Christ, the starved man on the cross, the poor man of Nazareth, who had no comforts. That's what I want, Mary." Mary 100% of the time answers and cooperates with that. So he was ordained in 1957, June of 57. He raised his hand and he asked his rector, "What's the worst place in the world?" And the rector said, "What are you talking? What's the worst place?" "Well, the Korean War just ended. It's a dystopian novel there. There's over 1 million people that died. Do they need priests in Korea?" Yeah, they do. They actually do need priests. Can I go? Yeah. So he got off the train in the Feast of the Immaculate Conception in 57. And that's what he saw in the dystopian novel. Get this, he saw beggars in the streets rubbing their diseased limbs off of people to steal their money. Busan, Korea, in the southern peninsula is where he settled. It's a very mountainous area, and there was thousands of the tubercular living in lean-tos and huts and tents up on these mountains where they would go to die. You'd walk by and you would just hear this cacophony of coughs. Nobody would go up on that hill because you were going to catch TB. Tuberculosis was rampant back then. There was mothers impregnated by American servicemen, European servicemen, who had babies living under bridges. They were pariahs in the community. They were left to die. And orphans, 1 year, 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, just left to fend for themselves on the streets like leftover war shrapnel. This is what Al saw on his first day. Father Al now. Father Al on the first day. 27 years old. And what does he do? He breathes it all in. He breathes in the decay and the human waste and the filth and the rot. And he says, "Mary, thank you. This is the incense of my new home. Now, finally, I can embrace the sweet violence of poverty. Thank you, Mary, for leading me here." He contracted a strange disease, an illness, in his first year in seminary. His first year in Korea. And he couldn't get better. His body was just sort of atrophying. his body was falling apart. And the bishop at the time of Korea was like, hey, you're the American renegade. You're the hotshot who said you wanted to come to Korea to serve the poor, and you can't get out of bed. And Father Al felt terrible, right? So finally they said, you're not getting better. You need to go back to America. And finally, no, I can't go back. I want to serve. I'll get better. So finally he ends up in Japan. They sent him to Japan for better medical help. So on New Year's Eve, 1958, he wrote this letter to Mary as a 28-year-old. He's just newly ordained. Listen to this relationship that he has with Mary. He's lost all his friends. His family thinks he's crazy for being in Korea. His priests out in Korea and his bishops are disappointed because he's not doing anything. He's just wasting away. So here's what he writes to Mary on New Year's Eve. To the Virgin of the Poor. For a long time now, I have entrusted to you all that I have and all that I am. You have taken all. I have nothing now. I am poor. My health you have taken from me. My good name you have taken. I am now counted among the disobedient or the psychotics or the fools, and I do not think that I exaggerate. My country, Korea, you have now torn from me. My mission vocation seems to be lost. My friends, for the most part, leave me. They leave me to my own devices. Materially, I have little. O Virgin of the Poor, I thank you. I wanted poverty, and it embraces me fiercely. Virgin, no, I give you nothing now. You have given me the gift of poverty and suffering, and by these two pearls I am ground into a host. O Mary, I dare not say I have nothing more to give, or what remains I do not know. It might be torn from me like a limb. So I renew now, so deeply conscious of what I am, my weakness, my imperfection, the words of consecration, all that I have, all that I am. O Virgin of the Poor, have pity. I am a beggar, and now I am all alone, and I am so weary, but I will risk all now. O Virgin of the Poor, have pity on me. Look at my tears. Have pity, have pity. Aloysius Schwartz, priest and beggar. Within 15 years of writing that prayer to Mary, all of South Korea and Korea was changed. A man with no business acumen, a man with no business sense, no college degree, was building and running 7-story high hospitals, 8 or 9 hospices all throughout Korea. Building and running elementary schools in the slums, building and running tuberculariums, leprosariums. Let them all come. I will pay for the doctors, I will pay for the teachers, I will pay for the instructors, I will pay for the care, I will do it all. Within 15 years, Korea was changed because he had become a slave to Mary. Throughout those 15 years, he was continually attacked. American bishops went after him. Tell this Father Al to stop taking our money. A letter came from the Vatican. Father Al said, help to himself. They've never seen the faces of the poor that I've seen. And a more strongly worded letter came from the Vatican 3 months later. You must cease and desist. No more money from Americans. What does a bold man do? He gets on a plane and goes to the Vatican. What does the Pope and his liaison do? Thank you for ignoring my letter. That shows me that you have a love for the poor. Carry on. His bishop stole money from him, tried to get him thrown out of the country, calumniated him, told those that he was having an affair. What happens to the bishop when you're protected by Mary? The Vatican comes to Korea. Hey Bishop, I know you got about 21 more years. It's time for you to go. He was removed. His own priests mocked him. Why did they mock him? Why did they mock him? Because when Father Al first stepped in Korea as a 27-year-old and he saw the magnitude of the poverty, the death, the orphans, the broken, the humiliated, the bullied, he said, Mary, what do we do? How do we start? Okay. You want me to move into a condemned shack? For 5 years, he lived in a condemned shack by a mountainside with no electricity, no plumbing, no running water, no comforts. It smelled, was mistaken for an outhouse. And of course, what does that shack do? It acts as a wine press that crushes every bit of American comforts out of him, and he begins to live like Jesus Christ. And when he comes out of the shack of discomfort, he's like a tipped-over chalice of our Lord's most precious blood that spills onto the streets of Korea and begins to save the brokenhearted. And then he sees all the children. He said, Mary, if we're going to rebuild this country, we have to rebuild it Catholic. So we started the Order of the Sisters of Mary. Today, there's 402 Sisters of Mary all over the world. I should say in 7 different countries. Not at 40 yet. And they're not at 40 because there was only one thing that could stop Father Al. Nothing could stop him. He passed right through all the threats, the mafia kingpin that wanted to kill him, the gangs of lepers that went after the sisters. It was all because of money. He was raising money for the poor. By the way, he never kept a nickel in his pocket his entire priesthood. Only one thing could slow Father Al down, and that was Lou Gehrig's disease ALS. At the age of 58, he was diagnosed.
The disease with which I am currently afflicted is called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, or more popularly, Lou Gehrig's disease.
When he was diagnosed, I don't know about you, but if I get Lou Gehrig's disease, I'm probably making amends with those that I've hurt maybe, or I'm slowing down or loving my wife and kids more and just trying to do my best. But what does Al say? Al says, well, what do we do, Mary? I've given you my life. You know, there's not much left in the tank. My voice doesn't really work that well anymore, and my clothes don't fit like they used to, and I use a cane. But Mary, what do you think? And he hears interiorly, man, Al, I'm losing my Juan Diegos. Poverty in Mexico is crushing the poor. They're leaving the faith. They're becoming pagans or agnostics or Pentecostals. I'm losing my Juan Diegos. Al, will you come to Mexico? He had spent his entire life, his entire priesthood in the Far East, rebuilding all the Philippines and in Korea. At this point, the Philippines and Korea, he had 16,000 children in these authentically Catholic places of resurrection, these boys' towns and girls' towns. And all of a sudden, Mary says, leave. Al says, okay. As he was dying, he knew he was going to vanish there. And he used to be in his wheelchair. He couldn't lift his head. Couldn't speak. Couldn't do much of anything. He used to go out on these job sites where they were building the first girls' town in Chalco, and his head would just drop. And his sister would pick it up. And the contractor would hear, you must hurry. You're behind in schedule. Kids used to come in by the hundreds, and Al couldn't absolve with his hand, so the child would pick up the hand, put it on Al's head, or put it on the child's head, Father Al's head, hand on their head for absolution. Up until his very last day, he was hearing confessions, celebrating Mass the best he could, and that's whenever he died. March 16, 1992. He had given his entire life to Mary. And as he was dying, Mother and I were talking earlier, he had 5 or 6 sisters of Mary surrounding his bed. He was calling out to Teresa of Lisieux. He had read Story of the Soul over 30 times in his life. It was the only book he mandated for his sisters to read. He had given his entire life to Teresa Lisieux, so you couldn't put a finger on him. He was like Damon the leper because he would stick his hand to the leper. He was like St. Francis of Assisi because he loved poverty and he would kiss the leper. He was like Mother Teresa because he was always in the gutters with the poor. But he was really most like, I think, like Teresa Lisieux because he wanted to give every moment of his life to God. So he was asking the sisters to read Teresa Lisieux's, she has a book on suffering towards the end of her life. And he was calling out to the virgin of the poor. His last words was calling out to the virgin of the poor. And he was saying, I asked to be Jesus' star man on the cross, and I've been granted that gift because I was nailed to the cross in my wheelchair. I have no dignity. I can't change myself. The sisters need to change me. Jesus, you were naked on the cross. I'm naked. I can't breathe much anymore. I'm going to suffocate. That's how I'll die. Jesus, that's how you died. Jesus, I'm in anguish. It's violent pain every day, and that's what you do. So Jesus, thank you. Mary, thank you. I asked to be Jesus' star man on the cross in the 1950s in seminary, and you give me that gift. And that's how he died.
In his book, Poverty, could you describe the difference in how he imitated poverty and understood it versus the superficial was very common, so that we know what to imitate?
Well, that's a great question. The book Poverty